Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and a tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another Roll20 review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the marketplace section of online role-playing website, Roll20.net. This video will be reviewing the D&D 5e campaign Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep, published by Wizards of the Coast and adapted by Roll20. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy these videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Now, I need to preface this review in the same way that I prefaced the review of Explorer's Guide to Wildmount when I reviewed that source book 2 years ago. I am not familiar with Critical Role. Obviously, I know of it. I've even watched an episode or two years and years ago. I'm really impressed with what they do, but I just haven't found the time to watch a 4-hour episode D&D campaign. I am neither, so I'm not a huge fan. I'm also not a hater. I just don't have any kind of context, and I don't know anything about like the lore or the world, other than the fact that I reviewed Explorer's Guide to Wildmount a couple years ago, and obviously I've been playing in D&D 5e for years and years, almost since its inception, and have been reviewing and playing and streaming all these, adventures and things. So, with that being said, this review will hopefully be useful if A, you want to know what the Roll20 adaptation specifically looks like, and B, if you want the opinion of somebody who isn't going to necessarily gush about Critical Role, nor am I out with an agenda to hate on it either. I'm just looking at it through the lens of, is it a good campaign, in the same way that I look at Storm King's Thunder, or Tomb of Annihilation, or Rime of the Frostmaiden, or Descent into Avernus. Like, just, how does it compare to all of those? I will say right out of the gate here at the top of the review, I think this is a really great adventure. It's pretty much runs the same level progression as most of the big 5e campaigns. It actually skips to level 3, which is fine. None of the campaigns, few of them, do a good job of getting you through those very early levels. So it runs from about 3 to, I believe you level up technically to 13 at the end, but you're basically 12 for the final boss fight. And I think it does a really fun job of creating a narrative-rich story, which I would presume Critical Role fans would be very interested in, but also with really good dungeon designs. And I mean, you can tell, obviously, the lead designers here include Mercer and Perkins, which, and James Hayek, which are all big names for D&D, and I think it's showed very well here that they do an excellent job with the storytelling. There's a lot of really great elements here that even makes me feel like they built upon the success of a lot of previous adventures, especially like Waterdeep Dragon Heist and Tomb of Annihilation, with the way a lot of the dungeons and the storytelling goes. So I'm a big fan of how it does all of those things, and it's not perfect. I have some problems with it here and there, and I'm going to go through those. But overall, I think it's a big thumbs up. And not even if you give a crap about Critical Role, but just if you enjoy good D&D 5e campaign adventures, especially one that actually has a well-designed story that you can get behind, because I think a lot of 5e campaigns, they offer a lot of good tools for DMs to use, but the actual main plot is kind of a disaster that DMs didn't have to cobble together. And this one, I think, actually has a main plot that you can run pretty much as is, and tells a very effective story, even though it doesn't really have a primary villain, which is interesting. Let's go over what you actually get with the Roll20 Marketplace module of Call of the Netherdeep. You get the Adventure, which is a full adventure campaign from levels 3 through 12. The campaign includes 5 non-gridded region and town maps, 2 10-foot square battle maps, which are subdivided into 5-foot square grids, and 7 5-foot square battle maps. I'll give you a quick glance at right here is all the maps, and yes, I do think that's a very low amount of maps compared to other 5e campaigns, and we'll get to that later in a bit. But the actual map art, as you can see, full color, full map art, which is a huge plus over a lot of adventures such as Descent into Avernus and Dragon Heist, which looked like shit on Roll20, frankly. We also get about 100 NPC or monster stat blocks with matching tokens and art handouts, including over 20 new monsters. Doesn't have a whole lot of new creatures. Tends to use a lot of the stat blocks that we've seen before with the monster manual, and maybe even things like Mordenkainen's or Volos and all those, but there are a few new ones, mainly aquatic stuff because there's the final area is all underwater, so you get a lot of these cool demonic underwater creatures, such as this fun fellow on the actual cover page. Over 25 named NPC stat blocks with matching tokens, over 40 magic item handouts, including over 20 that have artwork associated with them. Some select supplemental rules handouts from the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Anytime there's relevant rules, it'll appear as a little journal entry here that you can click on and share to your players. And over 40 player art handouts, not including the creature and NPC art, because a lot of those creature and all those tokens, and I can show you real quick, scroll down here. Shut it. Where is the creatures? There we go. Any one of these has a actual description here. You've got your character sheet laid out here with all the things you can click on, like so. And then you also have a token, and you've got this handout specifically. So this handout, if you want to just show your players a picture, you can just click on show players and it appears in their side of the journal. So basically, almost all of these creatures have these token art. A few of them don't, which is unfortunately something that's plagued Roll20 since the beginning. Because if there's like a creature variant or something that just didn't have associated artwork with it, then Roll20 will very rarely provide their own custom art. I don't know, there might be some murky rights issues there. And instead you end up getting these, what amounts to this, which is kind of the words printed on, which is never a good solution, but there's nothing stopping you from going and making your own token and replacing that. I'm not going to show you how to do that in the context of this review, but that is something you can do. Thankfully, for the most part, you're going to get art with all of these various creatures and NPCs. We also get the Call of the Netherdeep Compendium, which just means anything new that was added in here. Mainly, it's the new creatures, which I believe is included in the table of contents up here, right here. So all of these, which are the different adventuring rivals, and then where it says other creatures, which is about 20 or 30 or so, whatever I said. What did I say? Over 25 new monsters. So yeah, those are the ones that are going to be included in the companion, which means they're now included in basically anywhere that you can search any game you're in, and you can drag that onto your existing game, and you've got that creature. So it does include all of these monsters, but as you can see, all the ones that are labeled, if you can see the little MM1, the little ampersand symbol, those are actually included in the monster manual, even though they are included here as well. So if you don't own the monster manual in Roll20, you will get all these monsters in here because if you need them to play this module. I'm just saying that in terms of the compendium, you're only going to get the ones that are actually new when you purchase the Call of the Netherdeep pack. And you also get the art pack, which this is going to be difficult. Oh, good, I saved it on here. Okay, it's going to be tricky for me to show, except I already opened it up. So what that means is when you go into the art gallery, you'll have a section under Marketplace Purchases that says Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep. And it's basically they've taken every piece of art that's found in the book that could resemble a creature or a NPC or something and cropped it and turned it into a token, and also created some handouts out of there. And there are like 100 of these or so. This one's funny. This is actually, so this Drow Screaming Warrior is a bigger image of like these warriors fighting this gibbering mouther, and literally Roll20 just like took all the, it's almost like facial recognition software where they just take the pictures that could be, NPCs or player tokens or whatever, and cropped and made them into little tokens that you can use either as NPCs or player tokens, and then you've got all these extra things. And this is separate from the actual module, so if you wanted to use any of these tokens or handouts in any other game in Roll20 once you purchase this pack, you can do that. It's a simple matter of taking it, dragging it onto the screen, and boom, you've got access to all this stuff. So, and there's a ton of these too. Like I said, over 100 is a huge amount of NPCs. There's a lot of, a lot of these books have a lot of great monster art or environmental art, and this one specifically has good people art. And by people, I just mean, D&D, it's humanoids, whatever that amounts to, but really good for, which I think is the case that you need probably more than a lot of other kind of tokens, frankly, as these just, I need, NPC people art that can talk to my people. So let's go over the campaign a little bit. Not a lot of maps, which is a bummer. It starts at level 3. I think it has a really good inciting incident where the players start off in this town of Jigao. By the way, no region map, which is pretty distressing, because if you're going to have a campaign, you'd think step 1 is giving the players a map of the entire world. the only region map we get, we do have one region map, excuse me. We have the Shoras Overland, which is a crop of a bigger map, which you can find in Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, which I will show you because I have that tab opened up. So if you purchase Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, this is what you're looking at right now. This is the map of Wildmount, the actual continent. The map that you get with Call the Netherdeep, and you can see it, or like pointing at my screen, you can't see that, but you can see right here where it says Shoras, where my mouse is, this little kind of peninsula thing with the Emerald Gulch. So this is kind of a blown up version of that with actual, places and stuff on the map. And it's exciting at first when you see this, and this is kind of one of my primary complaints of the entire campaign, is you actually don't end up going very many places in this campaign. It's very linear, which is always a difficult line to walk with campaigns, and I get it. That's like I think the most challenging thing to do when designing a campaign is, on one end, you've got a linear but very narrative-rich story where things are happening in sequential order. You're playing the events of this movie. There's some great drama, and it's really nice. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's an open world where you're exploring and you're doing side quests, and it feels more, players are making choices about where to go and how to progress things. And the perfect campaign, I think, to me anyway, balances those two things. I know everybody's going to have different opinions on where on each spectrum you land, but I'd like to see at least, a campaign where you are going to be funneled in certain sections, because I think that's how you tell a good story, and others where it kind of opens up and you're allowed to go do, things and side quests and stuff, because I think that's just a fun part of RPGs. This campaign really starkly lacks the open world part of it. So even though you're looking at this region map, there's stuff on the map, the only two areas that you even go to in this entire zone is Jigao, which is the starting town, and Bazoxan, which is the next kind of town. Town is a weird word for it. It's like this town that they dug too deep and unleashed a gateway to the abyss, as you do. And it becomes this kind of fortress against a demonic incursion. So it's not exactly a safe town. It's almost a part town, part entrance to a dungeon. Anyway, and that's it. And then after that, you end up getting teleported to an entirely different continent, which we have no region map for. And the entire rest of the campaign takes place in and around and underneath, not even around, in and underneath the city of Ankaro. So that's probably one of my biggest complaints of the campaign. I hate to start like that because I really do love this campaign. But when you see this region map, you think, oh, cool. It's the first thing you do with a big RPG is you open that map, right? And you look at all the places you're going to go see. And I'm like, oh, this looks so cool. I can't wait to, dig into this adventure in this campaign. And that's how I felt. And I started reading about the adventure and where you go and what you do. And I was like, oh, there's actually not very much places. Now, it still has a very good, especially with and Carl, I think, later on in chapter 4, does a better job of an urban campaign than Waterdeep Dragon Heist did. I'm going to say that right now because I also have a kind of a low opinion of Dragon Heist if you go back and watch my review of that. But I think it does an incredible job with urban adventuring and having different factions you're working for and progressing through those storylines, everything. That's awesome. But it's a shame that at no point you ever leave that city and go out into the wider world and do anything. And same thing here. Once you get past the initial story hook in Jigao, chapter 2 is just the path to Bazoxan, which is the one travel chapter you have. But again, you're literally going from point A to point B. It's not like an exploration thing at all. It's like, hey, there's random encounters along the way, and then you arrive at chapter 3 in the next town. And then chapter 3 of Bazoxan. All right, so real quick, chapter 1, I know I'm skipping ahead, give my overview thoughts. And I'm going to comment on the campaign as we go. I'm not going to do a super big deep dive into every single chapter, but I'll show you maps and things. So you start off in Jigao, which I think is a fun element because they're having a big festival. I also think it's fun because I get like a Morrowind vibe from Shoras. And again, I'm not familiar. I'm not even probably pronouncing things correctly with, Wildmount and everything, except, again, from what I reviewed with the source book. But I love that you start off in this area that's not human dominated. It's not a bunch of humans, elves, and dwarves. It's a bunch of orcs and goblins and drow, which I think is really cool. And again, it makes me think of that Morrowind vibe where like the normal is very exotic and it's a wasteland and I don't know, it just feels very cool to be able to have your at least your first third of the campaign take place here, which is pretty nice. So you do this little festival and then the festival ends. I can show you the town map, which we do get a couple town maps because, like I said, the adventure is primarily urban adventuring. and there's a lot of fun things to do. There's pie eating contests. There's like battles you can do. There's a maze. There's you get on the back of big turtles and you go on this little race with the turtles, and then it ends with this little dungeon crawl through. And by the way, you're meeting your rivals, and the rival thing is such a cool part of this campaign. It is one of the coolest things this campaign does, and I'm so impressed by it. And it's so good that I think this concept probably needs to be included in like a dungeon master's guide in the future, and then like most campaigns in the future could benefit from running a rival party. And I'm not just, because it's not just, hey, here's some rivals you could run and then it forgets about them. No, these rivals, which is literally a rival NPC adventuring party, are included in every major step of this campaign. It even says, here's the characters, here's their their motivations and their backstories and who they are and what they like to do and what they're all about. And then it says, okay, in this, situation, here's how they act. And if the players act to them, here's how they would act. And you can really get a feel for how the players are going to have these relationships develop, not even with the rival party, but even with individual rivals, you could have, individual relationships, and rivals, they could even be friendly rivals, it could be a fun stuff, or it could be a real nasty one where they're just fighting each other all the time. The one thing I hope doesn't happen is you defeat them and literally kill them too early, which is a really tricky thing in D&D to be able to have your party not murder everything in sight. But it would work out so well for the story because they do such a good job of having these rivals be major elements of the story and really having them show up, throughout the entire campaign. You can see how each rival actually has multiple tier stat blocks so they can appear throughout these adventures in different, ways and show up. And they're very good at showing up, of course, at the most inopportune moments, or let's face it, the most opportune moments for the story to play out. They're on the precipice of discovering something and the rivals show up, or they're about to take, the big artifact they need and the rivals show up. It just all works very well. And there's all these different, there's not branching paths, but I love that the adventure does account for, hey, what if, the players don't grab the big important artifact, the one ring that they need, in this case, the Jewel of Three Prayers, and a rival gets it. Well, the adventure explains what happens then. What happens if if they're hostile to the rivals try to steal it. It explains that. It really goes through a lot of detail to making these a very memorable, important part. So it's not just the fact that they created rivals, but that they really integrated them very, very well into the campaign. I love that one of them is just a keen-eyed, smart, like ogre lady named Maggie, which is fucking awesome. I love these rival characters. And in fact, the campaign does too, because guess what? That's who's on the cover of the book, because you don't know who your player characters are. So most of the time you're putting, your big monsters or something on the cover, your big important NPCs. These are your rivals. That's how important they are in this campaign. And then this is the central figure that the entire campaign is about, which is this demigod named Alaxian. And the story goes, this demigod, which it's called an Apothian here, but I don't know, in my notes I kept saying demigod, which is somebody who had a very rough life, was born under this cursed sign of this other kind of dark moon of Exandria, and ended up, I'll paraphrase a lot of it, but ended up becoming this champion of the gods, defending against Grumsh, which is this huge god that tried to destroy the world, and ended up essentially kind of sacrificing himself, gave everything he could to protect people, and now that was forever ago, and people have forgotten about him, and his melancholy and this prison he created of himself deep into this Netherdeep region has begun to bleed out into the world, manifesting as this unique material called ruidium, and basically that's how the plot gets started. They discover his this important artifact, which is a vestige of divergence, which is a big part of the Exandria world, which is also a really cool thing that needs to be integrated in future D&D campaigns, which are magical artifacts that can upgrade. They become more powerful as you unlock new features, which is really cool. So it starts off, it's almost like having a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 of your artifact, but it's also very importantly drawn into the plot. And it's a little cheeky, I think, that in the very beginning it can cast invisibility. That's very Lord of the Rings of you designers, but I'll let it pass. So you end up going through this pretty cool little underwater dungeon in order to retrieve it. In fact, you're not even given the quest to retrieve it. You're given a quest to retrieve a thing from that's hanging from a giant shark, basically, and you have to defeat the shark. The rivals can either be there early, be there late, help you, hinder you. There's, already you're fighting with your rivals pretty early on. And then it smashes up against the rocks. And I love this map art, too. It's just incredible. And then that's when you see this glowing light, and you go in and you see the Jewel of the Three Prayers. And do you take it? Do you not take it? Do your rivals take it? Somebody's got to take it, because that's what actually brings the plot forward. You end up showing that to the elders, and the elder says, all right, you got to go to this other town to go figure out what this is. And you start, hearing visions of this powerful figure that wants you to free them. And that's essentially the inciting incident to the plot, which is a great start, I think. Really, really cool. So chapter 2 is just traveling over land to get to Bazaxan, which I'm going to kind of run past because it's a bunch of essentially random encounters in the waste, and it's really the only chapter that takes place in a specifically outdoors area, and it's just going from point A to point B, which is kind of disappointing. Chapter 3 takes place in fact, the only map we get for that entire area, which is a bummer that we don't get, I don't expect random encounter maps from Roll20 stuff too much. It's nice when we have those things, but it's weird that the only map we have for this chapter is one where no battle's actually supposed to take place. It's a cool looking map. You have this giant turtle, and there's this caravan here, but it's basically like a safe haven, like rest stop, shopping, social place in the middle of chapter 2, which doesn't need a map, but it looks really, really cool. I like the art. Chapter 3 of Bazaxan is, again, this weird town that has been fallen into. It was a previous like dungeon demon area, and now it's kind of this fortress that is this last stand area between this abyssal rift that demons constantly pour out of. Even when you show up, it's a bunch of gibbering mouthers in the streets. You got to help the commander like fight him off, and there's some cool NPCs and things you can talk to in the city and progress the quest and it basically says, all right, well, eventually you're going to have to go down to Betrayer's Rise, which is a fucking awesome dungeon. One of the coolest dungeons I have ever seen in a D&D 5e campaign. Easily Betrayer's Rise in chapter 3, which I believe is a level 5 or level 6 dungeon by now. Again, we start at 3, and you're advancing 1 or 2 levels every chapter. So already we're up to tier 2 by the time this one starts. The map art is incredible. The pathing is awesome. There's all these multiple paths you can take. It gates out these paths, but then always make sure there's like one like harder but also easier one to get to path you can take. The different things connect to each other. There's just amazing array of traps and puzzles and riddles and monsters and different ways of using creatures. Like these dancing flames use like the succubus stat block, but they're made of fire, and they try to like seduce you in and grab you and set you on fire. Like it's so well done, and I absolutely love this dungeon. This campaign is almost worth it enough for the dungeon designs, because I think that grotto was great. I think this dungeon's great, and I think it's almost a final 2-part dungeon with Kael Marrow and the Netherdeep is also really, Kael Marrow especially, which is an underwater like ruin dungeon, I'll show you in a second, is just incredible. So even though there are not a lot of dungeons in this campaign, which was also a problem with Wild Beyond the Witchlight. If you recall, that one only basically had 4 dungeons in the entire campaign. Now that one was a shorter one though; it was only take place between like 1 and 7, I believe. But it essentially had the three. I guess I shouldn't spoil it, but I kind of already did. Anyway, I think this is a really, really great dungeon. It's amazing. And then you get to it's got an interesting boss fight too, where you fight these orcs that are bathing themselves in the blood pool. They're immune to fire because of the ritual they're doing, and then the blood boils up and makes into this big hazardous room of boiling blood you're fighting them in, which is awesome. This is an example of how to use the rivals in an opportune moment, where there's this huge chasm right here, and you're essentially getting the vision of more information about the demigod that you're essentially working for, to trying to help or heal or hinder, whatever you want to interpret that as, and the artifact you've got, and then all the rivals show up, and you have this cool big fight. It feels very, Indiana Jones pacing and all that, which is really fun. And then you basically get teleported, which, by the way, I guess I should show you real quick for those of you not familiar how like dynamic lighting and things work. So all of this is plugged. This is a good map to show you on. So you can see the blue lines is where the dynamic lighting is in place if you're a Roll20 subscriber. If not, you'll have to use, Fog of War or something. So if we turn Vision on, and let's give you, let's just let you see things with a 2020. Okay, so right now you can see this is the way you do bright light and dark light. You can see here in dynamic lighting, Roll20 is already placed, essentially is turned off global lighting for this dungeon, but has lit up specific areas out here. So this is like the daytime area. And if I move this token in here, you can even say, without even looking at the token, kind of light he's giving off. And you can see the way the doors are closed. And then when I go beyond, in fact, I'll just show you that's what the player sees right there. It looks really good. The map art is incredible. And as I said, the dungeon design is really, really awesome. So I really like how all this is put together. So you then get teleported either by following the person who betrayed you, or by defeating her, or like she runs and you can grab one of her tablets. Like whatever happens, you need to basically take it, and you teleport to an entirely different continent called Marquette. And which is, I don't know if it's a desert continent or what is about it, but you end up teleporting to this, oasis city. Previously you were in towns. This is a huge ass city of Ankara, and you get this this is chapter 4 beginning, a very useful Ankara gazetteer, which again is similar to like Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus and Waterdeep Dragon Heist, where it included those big, long, lore building equivalent of a pamphlet, kind of an information dump of that city, and it gives you all this information. And here it does a very good job of giving you, district by district, what's going on, who are the factions that the player should care about, what's going on in this giant city. And that's useful because the entire rest of the campaign basically takes place in this city, which pacing wise, I think it works out pretty well so far, right? We had our initial inciting incident, the small town with that cool dungeon. Then we had the overland travel chapter where we went from one to another, getting to see some of what the Joras Waste has to offer and what Exandria has to offer. Then we end up in this demon town with this really, really awesome, like very much like a death trap dungeon, with a lot of the hallways. There was a bladed hallway where you suddenly start tilting and falling into the blades, and you have to fill up the vial of blood at the end. It's all very much like Tomb of Annihilation, kind of Tomb of the Nine Gods specifically. And that was a big dungeon crawl, and now you've got this big urban environment. So very good pacing so far. Now things slow down a little bit, but I think it does still a pretty good job of doing what Waterdeep Dragon Heist was trying to do, which was create a compelling urban narrative adventure. And the way it does that is by saying you basically need to ally yourself with one of 3 different factions. In all of those 3 factions, their goal is aligned with the players, which is trying to delve underneath to this ruined underwater ruins area, which basically has this portal to the Netherdeep region, which is where you're trying to go to be able to stop or help the entity who is trapped in there. So I love the fact that it's tied into the main quest there, and that each of these 3 factions has 6 different missions, and instead of, they really do feel like they're building off each one. They don't really feel like they're just one-off, like, hey, go fetch me this thing. Oh, you've proved yourself. Now you can join our club. It really is like, oh no, we've got like a mole in our midst, and you need to try to figure out how to stop this person. And then if you're allying yourself with the other faction, they're like, hey, you need to help our mole that's with this faction, and there's this thing you need to steal from this other person, and there's one of the factions, literally like one of the missions is just a straight up casino heist, which sounds really, really fun. There's only, I believe, 3 maps total that's included in this chapter, despite there being a ton of different missions you can do. But I think it does a better job of that choose your own path, choose your own faction thing than Waterdeep Dragon Heist did. Dragon Heist just felt so disjointed the way it kind of overlapped and was like, okay, insert this one here and insert that one there. And also, obviously, the maps didn't help it. But this one, I think, it does have much better maps. It has better storytelling, and I feel like it has a better narrative through line for going through from mission 1 to mission 6. And you can even do these early missions for any faction, but then once you have to formally join a faction to then do their final 4 missions. So you really have to choose, and there's no going back from there, which is interesting. And of course, the rivals can join a different faction, and that's how they end up, getting up to where your players are and all that. So I think this does a really good job of that. But I will say it's a bummer that they all take place in this city. None of them feature going outside. It's almost like I just wish there was maybe another chapter and we went a little bit further, and that chapter involved having to leave to go to another dungeon that was outside in the world. And meanwhile, there were more things you could go do and just more world building. It feels so constrained to have the initial excitement of going to this very exotic, different, and I imagine Critical Role fans too, like, oh man, this whole different continent, how cool. And the entire thing just takes place in this one city. Now, it's a cool city. There's a lot of things to do, as I mentioned. I think it does the urban adventure thing better than Dragon Heist, but it's a bummer that we basically never end up leaving. And then towards the end of each one, the sixth mission is usually to essentially secure the opening to the Netherdeep, or to what's it called, Kael Morrow, which Kael Morrow is awesome. This is the underwater ruins, which is currently partially been excavated by one of the factions already, and it's created using, it reminds me of like Bioshock almost, with like underwater tubes, except it's all magic. So you could literally pass through it if you want, but you can just walk through these tubes and it becomes like those, or aquariums basically, where you just see things like swimming all around you, except they're like fucking demon fish and demonic jellyfish and monster. There's an aboleth just chilling around, because of course there is. This is, by the way, like a level 10 dungeon by the time you're down here, and the design is really awesome. There's just a sea elf running a tavern down here, which is really neat. An entrance to the Netherdeep here, but in order to get there, you have to, of course, find and defeat a demonic jellyfish named Death's Embrace, which is a really cool looking picture with it. There you go. It's got a lot of really cool stuff going on here. A lot of really neat creatures, a lot of that unique underwater creatures. Kind of like the Betrayer's Rise, where even if you just wanted to use this as a separate dungeon for its unique situation and creatures and factions and things you can talk to, I think it's absolutely incredible. And then this eventually, and it does mention the fact that, hey, the players probably have to retreat at certain points and go talk to their factions and whatever, and then eventually you make it through the portal into the Netherdeep dungeon, which is really your final big mega dungeon. And this one very much feels like Tomb of the Nine Gods, because it even does so in Tomb of Annihilation, you had these trickster gods that could inhabit the players, and it didn't have to happen, but it gave them a magic item and a big benefit, but also like a role-playing drawback. In this case, you end up absorbing these fragments that belong to the Apotheon, Alaxian, that you are, hearing visions from. And it's really cool because every time you rest, every time you gain a fragment, every time you just trigger a certain story moment, you learn new pieces of information about this person, to where it really builds into this entire story. And I really love the fact that even though there's no antagonist here, you're still compelled to deal with this figure. And obviously the adventure wants to steer you towards redeeming them, but you don't have to. You could, especially if you just fail your skill checks or whatever, you could end up just killing them and making it a big boss fight at the end. Or you could even release them without properly redeeming them, and then you get like the worst ending because he just explodes and ends up being really pissed off and angry. So I think it's a really cool system. I love how you end up learning all these different lore pieces as you go through here. And like the trickster gods, you actually absorb these fragments, and these fragments give you benefits and drawbacks as you absorb them throughout this dungeon, which is even divided into 3 parts, and they're color-coded. One of them is like sorrow, one is fury, and one is just the desire for freedom. So they all have different, like, fury is obviously a bunch of angry things trying to kill you, and the desire for freedom is a bunch of like illusory stuff. It all works really, really well. And then eventually, once you've got one fragment for every party member, then you can unlock your way into the final battle, which is its own map. And then you've got a pretty big multi-stage boss fight with the Apotheon. And here it encourages you to, role play throughout, try to convince him to, hey, just let go. It's okay. We'll ease your suffering, which I think all works pretty well. It's very much a tortured figure that you've learned a lot about. It's become the central figure of your campaign, and you're ultimately trying to redeem them or destroy them. But either way, it kind of solves this problem of this angry demigod seeping through an angry, forgotten demigod who gave everything to the world and ultimately sacrificed himself. Everybody's forgotten about him, and that creates a lot of interesting, complex human emotions to deal with. So essentially, your antagonists really is your rivals, and unless you've really done a good job of befriending them, in which case maybe you don't really have a central villain, which I think is a bold choice, but it works here. I think it really does work pretty well. And I think the entire campaign works pretty well with the narrative structure. I think the maps are really good. The bummer is we don't get a lot of maps, which that's going to be one of my cons coming up when I do my pros and cons. But, most campaigns of this same scope and length have twice the number of maps this one does, which is it leans more towards that. And I know linear and railroad and all those things are usually spared against. We shouldn't do that. But honestly, it does create good story moments. I think this one does a good job of that. But that is the consequences. There's not a lot of other things to go do in between doing this. I almost wish maybe there were a little bit more side quests and things to go out and do, and especially having maps that could help support that. All right, let's go over my. Ooh, I'm very zoomed out. Let's go over my pros and cons for Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep. Pro, fully fleshed rival NPC party that interacts with the PCs throughout the campaign. Absolutely incredibly well done job. I think every D&D campaign needs to incorporate the rival party, but not just to add them at the beginning and say, hey, here's some rivals that your party can meet, but actually have them be major characters. This is the equivalent of not even... Well, maybe they'd be supporting characters. They don't appear in literally every scene, but they're still extremely important throughout every season or whatever of our series. They literally have different stat blocks. They have tiers. They grow in different ways. Things happen. One of them loses his arm in a fight, it says, and he's got to replace with another arm, and that makes him more cautious and withdrawn. And it's such a cool job of really building them out like they are just other PCs adventuring throughout this campaign that meet up with your PCs and can create all those really interesting relationships. Pro and Carl Gazetteer provides a wealth of information for the new hub city in the latter half of the campaign. That's just me saying, hey, I think this is a really good job at making an urban adventure and has all the tools to support that. Pro, excellent faction quest that tied directly into the main plot. All right, that was 2 pros. I think it did a really good job of doing the urban adventure. Pro, few but phenomenal dungeon designs with high quality map art, which I need to credit the cartographers too. Credit to the cartographers Stacy Allen, Will Doyle, and Devin Rue. That's some of the best dungeon map art I have seen in a long time, and Wizards has been skimping on the map art for a lot of their products lately. And some folks don't give a crap about maps. They say, whatever, we do theater of the mind, or we just, write down graph paper on the table. That does not work for my group. We play on a virtual tabletop 90% of the time. 100% of the time with my group, and map art goes a long way towards immersing us into what we're doing. So even though there's not a lot of maps here, what is there is extremely high quality, and that I'm very appreciative of. And Pro, helpful dungeon master tips for Roll20 users. I skipped over this. This is something that Roll20 started doing only pretty recently, and eventually I may take it off my pros because it'll become a normal thing, but right now I still want to give it a huge thumbs up, which is just helpful stuff for new DMs and even for folks like me who've been playing forever that just give you hey, here's how token vision works, here's how the different map layers work, here's how you can ping things, here's how you roll for initiative, here's how our dynamic lighting system works, and it's just all displayed as a very helpful map on here that's obviously really only DMs are supposed to click on and use. To where you can just sit there at a glance and look at, rather than trying to find everything, in the journal and look at, okay, game settings, I need to figure out how to use all this, or macro tables, I need to figure out how to use all this. That can be overwhelming, but just looking at this is a very smart way of doing it. Cons, you probably already guessed. Marquette's adventuring, which is the second continent, is limited to a single city and what lies beneath. So that's my way of condensing my complaints of the adventure's overall linearity into that single complaint. I really wish, especially in the second half of the campaign, it wasn't all literally just urban adventure and then final underwater dungeon crawl. I really wish there was a chance to explore that continent, go out and do more things. I guess I just wish there was more content in general, because I think what's here is really good. We're just missing that element of hey, here's some just side quest content. That's good quality content, but isn't necessarily just driving the main story. And then my other con is the relatively low number of maps. And the reason that's a con, even though they're all good, is because when you compare it to other products that are a similar price, although I will say Netherdeep is released at a cheaper price level than the other ones, it's more in line now that with those have dropped in price. This one includes only about, 14 or 15 total maps, and that's including the city maps and things that you're not actually battling on. Compared to something like Tomb of Annihilation, Rime of the Frost Maiden, Descent into Avernus, I looked back, loaded up all of those campaigns, and counted how many maps we get, and it's closer to 30. So literally this has about half the number of maps as are included in those adventures. That's a bummer. Specifically, it's a bummer for Roll20 because maps obviously are a lot of what make or break these adventures. Final verdict, whether you're a huge fan or a neophyte, Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep is a well-crafted, narrative-rich adventure that builds upon the best parts of previous 5e campaigns. Thank you everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewanson.com. You can watch more reviews, follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewanson. Rogue Watson, shouts to Platinum Patrons, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Thomas, Adam, Stan, Nathan, William, I'm Loud, Al, Kyle, Scalenia, Genocider, David, Jammin, Clam, Seth, and Nebula99. And Gold Patrons, RPG, Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, Annie, Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Faz Like a Tortoise, James, and Perry. Thank you all very much for your support.